Thank you very much. Okay, well, before we get into a conversation, we're just going to check back in on that poll. It did happen, and thanks everyone for voting. So we asked, what's the biggest barrier to good architecture? Fairly close on race. It's still happening by the looks of things. Procurement's come top, and this is a warm-up, but we'll be going back to this poll or different polls as we go through the day. So please keep on checking on Slido. And thanks to everyone for submitting questions. I'm going to jump straight to some of the questions that people have been putting forward. So Dan, you talked about designing at the stage, RIBA stage -1. How do we get that kind of work? So we've got a question here from Chris Bryant. What can the architecture design community do to collectively position ourselves further upstream?
I suppose it's worth saying that although I'm not an architect, about half my team are. So I've got about 10 people on the team, at least 5 of them are architects and all planners. So I'd say they are doing that work. We do it as a consultant, so we don't do it in a way that I suppose the traditional business model of architecture might have been as a percentage of construction costs or anything. We wanted to deliberately free ourselves from that, so as you could see from the kind of work we're doing, we could go in a very free way to explore with the client or the collaborator what the project is, what the right tool might be that might not involve a building, but architects are still massively useful, of course, fundamentally useful in a conversation even when there isn't a building on the table. Because of the higher order skills that you've all been trained to work through, they're hugely useful outside of that. So I think there's, it's simple in that sense. There's no reason why you can't get that work. You have to find them, you have to figure out where the clients are and go to them. I think maybe that's another thing, I suppose. Not waiting for a competition or not waiting to be asked by a client to procure something, but then to create the job in the first place. So
do you think the traditional fee structure of architects, so as a percentage of build costs, is a barrier to moving upstream? And how do you make that kind of work pay, particularly for small practices who want to get involved earlier upstream?
Yes, is the first thing to say. I mean, I think architects are pretty crap at getting themselves, getting paid for stuff they do anyway. I include myself in that, by the way. So I think we have to, I think it's a cultural shift. I think it's a really much bigger, it's a kind of much bigger thing, if you like. I think we have to really think hard about where we are positioning ourselves in society, how we are affecting change, how we are using our skills to make a bigger difference. And we, I think, have been focusing quite rightly. So we sort of we've been looking inward too much, and we've been focusing too much on the kind of work that we do, making buildings, that we've sort of slightly lost our way in the bigger political arena. And I think the more we can have conversations, the more we can talk about quality of life. Quality of life is something that everybody now is talking about. Everybody is wanting to kind of bring into policy, and who better to make our lives better than people who can design it better. So I think that if we can start as a profession to be a lot more vocal, we can be a lot more proactive, just about talking about those issues, not to ourselves, but to the wider audience, then I think we'll take a leap of credibility. And the minute you have a leap of credibility, and people want AI, people want people who know about digital, they don't even look at us and think, we need you. Bloody hell, they need us, but they don't know that they need us. So we've got to remind them that they need us. And the minute they know they need us, then the minute they'll ask us in as early on, and they'll want to pay us for it, instead of thinking that it's, aren't you lucky that you can come and talk to me about it? So I think that it's a much bigger issue actually, and it's something that has been kind of, we've been falling behind for years and years and years, and we've just got to get back on the front foot.
I think, that's why I use the Uber example, because that's the wider ethical dimension that architecture has for the city, and the city as a public good, was entirely missing in that debate. There was no one at TfL that could handle that, so Uber just cut right across them, as they tend to do. So that's to do with positioning partly, and it's why your stuff's so important about public practice, for sure, about creating also opportunities inside the public sector. And we know there's been a huge shift in the UK over the last 35, 40 years or so, from 50% of the profession working in the public sector in about 1975 to what is it now, 0.9%? Less than 1% in the country. So that dropping out has not just changed the way that then practice happens. It's been a huge loss of strategic intelligence, I would say, inside the public sector, because those architects they're not there anymore. They're not in that position that they would have been once, say, at London County Council Architecture Department or others, where there were, 1,500 people working in 1953. So that putting back into public positioning one way or another, either being employed there, half the work that I showed was from a public sector side, the other half was private sector, or addressing those clients from a private sector position, that's also fine. But making the case, as Sadie said, around this is the broader value of design. This is entirely a design question or an architectural and urban question around things like AI or Uber or identity, any one of these things.
But that seems to be something common to both your practices, is redefining the perception of the architect's role or the designer's role as being beyond just making better buildings. And we got a question here by one Pooja Agrawal on this subject. So, is the role of the architect to build good buildings or make better places? But critically, can the two ever be in conflict?
You always ask really clever stuff, don't you? I'm like, ooh, I don't know about that. Yes. I mean, we have to do both. We have to make better places, and we have to make better places by making better buildings that fit within those better places. And we have to make better places because we make buildings that are better connected within those places. So I think it's, we have a wider responsibility when we're thinking about our buildings or just building a building, how it fits, how it's connected, how it lives within the city. If we can think about everything in a slightly wider context, then we will be able to do both.
What she said. But I think also, it can't be mutually exclusive. Obviously, it's not a trade-off or a zero-sum game. One is directly joined to the other. You can't have a good building if it doesn't in some way contribute to a better place. It's almost the definition of good. It doesn't work in that sense. But I think, I guess what I'm interested in is broadening that out from looking at what better place might imply. That was tons of things, obviously. Service layers, the way that people interact with things, the way that people talk to each other, public realm, energy, mobility, all of the infrastructure of everyday life and the complexity of that can be our remit, And then buildings are a part of that. They're one of the more interesting layers within that, but it's clearly not the only answer. And you can't limit yourself to that, I'd say, if you want to make a better place. It's sort of using, it's a hammer only sees nails kind of problem. You cannot have the building as the only outcome of that design process. There's so many other things.
To make the case for the role of designers or architects further upstream in those systems, question here from Dieter Kleiner. How do we change the misconception that designers add cost? Do we accept it as true, focus on the value, or demonstrate it is not and increases efficiency, etc.?
You publish research, so this is such a kind of relevant question. I continually, it's the one thing that we continually kind of fight against. And I didn't show you a set of slides that I had, but one of the pieces of research I did, commissioned, that Publica did for the National Infrastructure Commission, was what are the barriers to good design? And they interviewed all the leading CEOs of all the big infrastructure projects and various other people, and they asked that very question: what do you think about design? And the biggest, the sort of most, the biggest, the most, I can never think of the right things to say, but anyway, the thing that came up the most was that good, design costs extra money, and it leads to it makes the program longer. Now, it's just not true. It's not true if you make early design decisions if you bring design right early on in the process. So how do you convince, it's kind of relentlessly boring to have to do this, but this is just the way it is. And that's because culturally we have, back again to the kind of culture of the people who are running these big projects, they just, we have got ourselves in a place where people just look at it and think, people look at me and it's like, oh God, Sadie's back again. I'm kind of, I'm so sort of, I'm just a pain in the arse whenever, they're kind of polite to me, but you can tell that they're just like, oh, because, and so we need advocacy. We need people, we need people who are on the board of these big projects saying it matters and telling everybody that the outcome will be better because of it. And we need to prove that by showing good examples of how design saves money and makes the program shorter. And there are really good examples out there. We've also did a piece of research that showed exactly that. So I think we can't just talk about it. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's like, I do all that, like, yeah, it says, and everyone just looks at me and saying, and you think, actually, well, the only way out of being the rah-rah girl is to actually come with hard evidence and show that in big projects and good examples of where design has led to cost savings and program.
Yeah, it's a weird hang-up. I can't think of another design profession that had that levelled at it in the same way. Like no one asked Jonathan Ive to prove his value to Apple, I suspect, or to, can you just quantify the design team's impact on the iPhone just before we do the next iPhone without you? That's not going to be a conversation, is it? Or any one of those other design treaders, Volkswagen or whatever. It's absolutely fundamental to the way those things happen. And I know architecture is fundamentally different, of course, in a sense, but I'd argue it's not more complex, and it's not necessarily more complex than making something as complex as the supply chains and everything involved in making an iPhone happen. So it's a funny position we've got into as a profession, to be backed into that corner, and it shows there's something deeply fundamentally wrong with either the business model or the way, as you say, that we're conveying ourselves to our clients and collaborators or the wider public. So I'm just going to flip it back and say, very few other design disciplines have to justify that in that way. And why is that? And how does architecture then think more broadly about what its value might be?
Well, thank you. That's all we've got time for this session. Hopefully we'll pick up tactics, not just from your talks, but from the rest of the day about how to make that case. And not just at the scale of national infrastructure, but also at the scale of a local design review panel or the procurement of your local school. I think a lot of these approaches are transferable. So we've got a 15-minute coffee break now, back here at 11:40. Thank you. And thank you to our speakers.